Now that we know how to select a topic, the next step is how to go about actually writing your speech. So Chapter 6, which is part of Tab 3. Note, we did skip Tab 2. We will come back to that later. We are skipping to Tab 3. Chapter 6 talks about how to go about outlining your speech. So this whole block of chapters is going to be covering how to outline, research, write your speech. This has nothing to do with how you will be delivering it. That will be in the next chapters in the next tab, Tab 4, that we will be covering next week. So, Chapter 6 is all about how to outline your speech, what needs to be covered in there, things to keep in mind when you're assigning your main points and your subpoints, things along those lines. So the very first thing the chapter talks about is that there are 4 parts to the outline. You have your introduction, which has your attention grabber, your thesis or central idea, those terms are interchangeable, and the preview of your main points. We'll be going into more details with how the introduction works in another chapter. The second part to your paper will include the body. This is the meat and guts of what you are presenting. This is where you have all of your main points, all of your subpoints. You got to make sure that you link each main point to the next main point, and we'll be going over that in a little more detail here shortly. But the body is everything that you have to say that is supporting your central idea or your thesis. After you complete that, you have your conclusion. So your conclusion is going to be reviewing your main points, restating your thesis or central idea, and then a term I use called a clincher. The book calls it a wow moment. But it is the final sentence of your speech, which is the major takeaway that you want your audience to remember, because it is the last thing you're going to say. You want it to be powerful. And then lastly, you have to have a source page. That is just where it's also commonly called a works cited page. This will not be stated in your speech, but it is required to provide information as to where you got anything that you shared that you got from another source. So it's just a final thing that you have to throw on the end of it, just like with a paper that discusses all of the locations that you got information besides from your own brain. The book goes on to talk about tips for an effective outline. So it starts with at the very beginning of your outline, the very beginning of your speech on paper, you should make sure that you record the topic, the specific purpose, or the central idea or thesis. That's just going to, once you have that set up, then you always know what your goal is. You always know what you're trying to accomplish. For an effective outline, this is specifically for a prepared outline or your delivery outline, you want to use full sentences. Your formal outline, you need to use full sentences. For your working outline, that's not quite as important. But for your formal outline, you need to use full sentences. For each main point and each sub-point, you want to make sure that you are only covering one issue at a time. I like to go by the rule you want to avoid ands. So today I'm going to talk about penguins and monkeys. That's trying to cover 2 things. So instead you want to make sure that you're just covering one. Now if you're covering animals at the zoo, your first main point might be about penguins and your second main point might be about monkeys. But you don't want your one main point to try to cover both of those because it's 2 different ideas. So you want to cover only one issue at a time. You want to make sure that you spend adequate time developing your introduction and conclusion, which we'll be going into more detail with those in the next chapter. That's super important to ensure that your introduction, which is going to grab the audience's attention, is strong, and your conclusion, which is what the audience is going to remember, is strong. That is super important when writing and presenting a speech. You want to make sure that you're going to be using the correct outline format. So if you look at pages 132 through 133, it kind of gives you an idea of how to format an outline. I will also be posting in this same tab an example of a proper formal outline for you to take a look at. A few other tips to have an effective outline. You want to make sure that you use balanced main points. So what is meant by that is you want to make sure that each main point is about the same length. So you don't want to have your first main point with 1 subpoint, then your second main point with 6 subpoints, because that makes each main point unbalanced and it is not going to lead to as successful as a speech. On that same note, we also want to make sure that I call it the rule of 2. So if there's a 1, there has to be a 2. If there is an A, there has to be a B. And you can have a C or a 3 to continue down. 3s do not need 4s. But if you have a 1, you have to have a 2. Otherwise, it's not a strong enough point for you to have. Make sure that you are using subordination, so subpoints. So if you have a great main point, usually that main point needs further support, so you have a subpoint. The next thing is to make sure that you plan out formal links, which is how you're going to transition from your first main point to your second main point, and from your intro into your body. Each of those needs to have some form of link, which we will go over later on. And then lastly, making sure that you use proper citations. That is just something that is a good process to have, whether you're writing a paper or a speech. You need to have proper citations both in your speech, which we'll go over later, and in your works cited page, your sources page, which is at the end of your outline. Those have to be done properly, otherwise you start entering the realm of plagiarism, which, as I stated on my syllabus, is something that could cause you to lose all credit for your speech. The book then goes on to talk about the 3 main types of outlines that you will be using. So your working outline is just your initial outline. It's just getting your thoughts out. It may not be super organized. It may not be super planned out, but it's getting you to the point where you can then write a preparation outline. So that's a lot of the times where the brainstorming, or where you just start coming up with ideas. And a lot of times when you're doing that, you'll realize something that you wanted as a main point isn't strong enough that it should actually be a sub point, or things along those lines. So working outline is just used to organize your thoughts. The preparation outline, which I call a formal outline, is the longer, more detailed speech that you are going to give. It's the speech in its entirety. This is what you are going to be turning into me when I require you to turn in an outline. It's going to be your preparation or formal outline. Then the last form of outlines out there is your delivery outline, and I call that the brass tacks outline. That is when you complete your preparation outline, you condense it into its most bare form, the just barest hints of what you need to be able to know what you're talking about. And that is what you are going to use when you are presenting your speech. I want to stress, and it's got a little cut off here, but you cannot use your formal outline when you're delivering your speech. You're going to be using something called extemporaneous speaking, which again I will go into more detail in a later chapter. But you will not be allowed to use your formal outline when you are delivering your speech. You're going to be using a delivery outline on note cards. The book then talks about the different types of ways you can link your speech together. And so when we're talking about that, that's how you link your intro to your first main point to your second main point, your last main point to your conclusion. Every single one of those, you have to have a sentence of transition. It's a way of saying, I'm done talking about this thing, and I'm now going to talk about this other thing. So some of the ones that the book likes to talk about a little bit here are things like transitions, which, if you look on page 144 of the book, it has a whole lot of types of transitions, but it's words or phrases that signal movement from one place to the next. That's probably what you're going to use the most. Then you have signposts. So these are things that can help let the audience know that you're transitioning from one thing to another. So those are a lot of times, first I'm going to talk about this, then I'm going to talk about this, or first I'm going to talk about this, my second point is this, my final point is this. But it's using the first, seconds, thirds. That's what signposts are about. Internal previews or internal reviews, those are when within the main point you hint at what you are going to be talking about later or what you have talked about before. The book does talk about one type of transition, or you might even call it a signpost, that they count as an acceptable transition, but I do not. And so I want to take a moment here and highlight this. When you are starting your speech, you can't start with "today my speech is on," because that's not an attention grabber. So we'll get to that in the next chapter. But for transitioning from your last main point to your conclusion, I do not ever want to hear anybody start their conclusion with "in conclusion." My justification for that is, when you start by saying "in conclusion," it is as if you are spoon-feeding it to the audience that you are starting your conclusion, and it makes me feel like you are almost being patronizing to your audience, basically not necessarily purposefully accusing them of it, but making them feel like we're too stupid to know you're starting your conclusion. And so because of that, I will always mark you down in your conclusion if you start your conclusion with "in conclusion" or any of its variants. So to sum up, or to cover what I went over today. All of those things are the same thing as starting with "in conclusion." So when you transition into your conclusion, it's going to be obvious to the audience, because what you are more likely going to say is, between whether you're visiting monkeys or penguins or the giraffes, the Minnesota Zoo has something for everybody. Now there I've just summarized my main points, but I've also signified I'm moving into the conclusion by giving an encompassing sentence. And we'll go into that more in the chapter on conclusions. So then quickly I want to go over a few things that the book talks about with citing your sources. You can use any form you want. MLA, APA, Chicago. If there's another style out there, let me know. But just make sure that you have the proper format for that way of citing your sources. I want to stress that you must cite anything that you did not pull from your own brain. So if you went online and pulled something, if you pulled something out of a book, anything that didn't come out of your own brain, if you went somewhere to get this information, you must have that citation. The book goes into MLA and APA citations on pages 147 and gives you some better examples on pages 150 and 151 if you are unsure about the exact way of citing sources. I will also be posting in this same tab an example of MLA, just giving you the brass tacks of examples of how MLA will look. So just make sure that you are citing it properly, that you are citing everything that needs to be cited, and that you have everything covered that needs to be covered. So that is Chapter 6 in a nutshell. That is what you need to know about making your working outlines. On that note, when you get your formal outlines completed, so long as it's done at least 48 hours, so 2 days before the speech is due, if you email me a copy of your outline, I will be happy to look at it and get back to you with any recommendations for things that can be improved on it, or to let you know that you are on the right path and that I'm excited to hear what your speech is on. So the next lecture will be on Chapter 7, which is organizing the speech body, and then the lecture following that will be covering all of the ins and outs of introductions and conclusions. So look for the next lecture, which will be on Chapter 7, which is part of Tab 4 in your public speaking textbook.